Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a little bit of commentary on this conversation between Adam and Glenn Scrivener. Now, Glenn is a pastor, evangelist, does YouTubes out of the UK, and many of you know Adam. He runs the Think Club channel, and Adam and I have had a conversation in the past. Adam is a very interesting guy because he's really a sociology nerd and he's an atheist, so he spends a lot of time poking at the anti-theists, which I think is uh, it's just kind of fun to watch them go at it, partly because Adam himself is an atheist, and I'm sure a bunch of the anti-theists want to take away Adam's atheist card, but that is who he says he is. And so I thought but Adam as an atheist is a very interesting one because unlike many of the anti-theists, he has a high regard for religion, and he sees its practicality, he sees its benefits. He himself just doesn't believe it. He's a materialist, and that's where he's at. So I thought this conversation was a very interesting one, and they touched on a couple of things that I wanted to get at. Part of it was this grounding of morality, which is an interesting metaphor. It comes out of kind of an evidentialist, foundationalist theory in terms of knowledge that we have should be, even the metaphor of this should be grounded, built up, and that's what keeps it from being relativistic. Now Adam believes that morality is grounded, and this is where he's obviously found a lot of inspiration and support in the work of Jordan Peterson, because Peterson's work is morality from the ground up. In 3.5 billion years of evolution, watching ourselves, watching each other, we've built this a priori platform within us, and from that platform we have figured out morality, but in ways that we can't necessarily articulate. And so that then gets expressed by poets and by artists and by great works of literature. And so this morality problem isn't something that we ourselves master, because it's not something that we ourselves as individuals have constructed, but it's something that we sense and feel imperfectly. And so we represent it in different ways, in different stories, in different laws, so on and so forth. And Adam, with all of his background in sociology, now seeing Jordan Peterson articulate this so well, very much sees this then as the source of morality. This, in terms of my abolition of man videos that I've been doing on C.S. Lewis, that's the Tao. And it's not something that we can articulate. It's something, in a sense, we bear witness to, we express, we sort of know it. And it's in this way that Adam finds many of the celebrity atheists, or as he calls them, career atheists, to be cop-outs, in that they like the rest of us have a sense of the Tao. They have a sense of this moral realism, but they simplify it, they codify it in simplistic ways. And so I think Adam's perspective, and Adam certainly will, Adam has the ability to comment on whole ranges of videos. You'll find Adam's comments, Think Club, all over the internet with these kinds of discussions, and so he'll probably weigh in here, especially since I'm talking about him directly. But so that's kind of the formulation, and Peterson is out there. And whereas Peterson I would categorize as an open agnostic, and actually I'm going to do a second video on another video by Noah Plum that Adam also did a response video to, but I thought there were some important things in that. I'll do that video today or tomorrow. But Adam's perspective, Peterson is more of an open agnostic atheist. That gets into the whole thing of what does Peterson really believe, and then the question, does it matter in terms of this conversation? So but Adam he's an atheist. That's where he's at. And so I thought this conversation with Glenn, and hopefully I'll do a conversation with Glenn probably in a week or two, I thought this conversation was quite interesting. But here they're getting into this business of the grounding of morality. And as I play this, I want you to pay attention to the language. I want you, as they speak, I want you to think about what the word rational means in this context and what evolution means in this context. So let's listen in on a little bit of this conversation.
The the grounding of the morality is an interesting question, because you brilliantly explained this in the video where you do the trousers thing, and Hemet Meta, I'm not sure it ever really even answers like where his morality comes from. I don't think he's familiar with moral foundation theory. I don't think he knows that his morality is basically, I mean, if you observe him, you can see that his morality is mostly a liberal, progressive morality based on care harm, which is what.
Now, when Adam says care harm, he's noting that Jonathan Haidt in his work has these 5, 6-ish moral taste buds. Care harm are the two that progressives tend to focus on. Conservatives tend to fill out the plate a little bit better and round it a little bit better, but progressives tend to really focus in on care harm almost exclusively from the others.
What Jonathan Haidt lays out in The Righteous Mind. He doesn't know this. And if you said to him, your moral intuitions are what's driving the ship, he would probably bristle at the idea of that. Most anti-theists do. But Haidt lays this out in The Righteous Mind, that the grounding in a deity is a good way to ground moral ethics, just because it has the force of, people are going to stay in line.
Now, when you hear all of these value judgments in here, it's a good way to ground moral ethic. Now, what do we mean by good in that phrase? It's a practical way. It's an effective way. Now you might wonder, well, why are you picking at all these words? Well, I'm a pastor, and pastors, at least part of our jobs, are exegetes. And if you go to my blog, leadingchurch.com, which is basically a link dump. So you'll find all kinds of links there that you disagree with. And there's all kinds of links that I disagree with. When I find a link that's interesting, I dump it on my blog. But, I say I'm a word gardener of the age to come. Now, what does that mean? It means I pay a lot of attention to words. And so when Jonathan Haidt and Adam here said, well, this, basing it in God is a good way. Well, it's an effective way. It's a practical way. But what I want us to see throughout this video is that all of this language, and this is a point I've made on many of my previous videos, all of this language implies a telos. And so if you want to evaluate, you want to really discern and understand what a given system is really driving at, discern its telos, discern its end, discern what it says the purpose is, what it says the reason is, where it says it needs to go. And as we're going to see, evolution seeks survival. Okay, well, survival of what? And you get into Brett Weinstein, and this enzyme seems the perpetuation of its code at the expense of every other rival code. So let's keep listening.
You're more likely to stop cheaters, which is the evolutionary problem in putting people into these groups, is bringing cheaters and slackers into line. The idea of a God is a very good way to bring cheaters and slackers into line, but it's a very mechanistic way to do it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one question would be, within the Darwinian frame, yes, you can say that perhaps Christianity has proved itself to be adaptive to the West. But then you would also have to say that Hinduism has proved itself to be equally adaptive to the Indian subcontinent, right?
Right.
And then what do you do at that stage? So with the British Raj, there they are in India. There is the practice of sati, which is the burning of widows. And it surely within the Darwinian frame, you have to say that the burning of widows on the funeral pyre with their husband has proved itself to be adaptive to that, that culture. We in the West tend to think differently. What is it that makes us say, that does not make us say, well, each to their own? What is it that sort of, there was that famous case of the...
you could make the argument rationally. You very much could. Because
you could make the argument rationally, okay? Now what does Adam mean right there by rationally? Because this is all of these worldviews have their languages, and the words function within those worldviews and they function differently within one worldview as within another worldview. Now, when you say you could make it rationally, I think what Adam means here is that you could make the argument that burning a widow on her husband's funeral pyre works within that context towards the end of bolstering and strengthening that culture, specifically against its rival cultures. That is that is one way of understanding what it means rationally. And in that sense, rationally is a conditional good. It's a good that's framed within a context. It's a good that's nested within a world. Now, what you're also going to hear, especially among a number of the career atheists, that rationally becomes a view towards good in itself. Now, if you've been following my videos on C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, Lewis uses the word that way sometimes, and the career atheists use that word sometimes. And in that sense, when you use that word, when you use rational in that sense, it's within the nested worldview of, let's say, rationalism. Now, I don't mean rationalism necessarily as a rival to Christianity, because obviously C.S. Lewis was both sort of a rationalist and a Christian, but for Lewis, reason was witness to the presence of what naturalists would call the supernatural. Lewis would say, well, that's part of God shining on this world. But again, now pay attention to that word, how it's used in this conversation.
Because you could make a case if you're looking at it from a group unifying perspective. The idea that burning a widow on the funeral pyre would foment, I mean, the idea that would foment conflict within the group is seems like a pretty good case to be made.
Now, what's interesting, though, is that, again, of course, all of these practices, just as burning a widow on the pyre of her dead husband's funeral pyre, and the British stopped this, obviously, and now on the left, well, this is just another example of a colonial impressive, of a moralistic colonialism, where you're just forcing the morals of your group on that, which is why, of course, Glenn brings this up, because it's just a great example of, well, you're in a bind, because if you say, well, that's part of this colonialism that's oppressing the Indian people with the culture and religion of the West, but most people in the West would also believe in women's equality, and then Glenn basically has you in the trap and saying, well, how do you justify women's equality? Upon what basis? This is where you get to the grounding. How can you ground that? Now Adam is making the argument here about that what morality does is bind people together in teams, and religion does well is bind people together in teams. And of course, he gets this from Jonathan Haidt, who makes this point very, very well. But then the question is, okay, is there such a thing as a morality that stands outside of and can in fact critique and push against that which is pragmatic towards survival? And we're going to get a lot deeper into that question as we get through this video.
You're also limiting your resources by
it happened for thousands of years up to that point.
Well, I think there are moralities that are adaptive, that there are better moralities. I think.
See, and again, when better morality towards what end? Towards a Darwinian end?
Moralities are constantly competing, and they're competing in whether or not the group survives. The group that adopts any kind of moral framework either has a survival advantage against other groups or doesn't. So,
and right there, I think is really the definition of morality that Adam is working with. And I think that's a definition of morality that is implicit in a lot of what Peterson is doing. The question is going to be, here in the West, is that really our definition of morality? Is that really the definition of morality we want? And I'm going to ask the question, is that definition of morality really fully functional, back to the grounded, all the way down? Now let's look at definitions. And again, I talked about this a little bit. Okay, rational. It's often used as that which relates to non-religious reality. And you'll hear Sam Harris and a lot of the career atheists use rational in that way. To be rational is to, and again, they have a correspondence view of truth. And so to be rational is to act in a way that corresponds to this correspondence view of truth. And again, I'll say C.S. Lewis is not opposed to that way of thinking, and it's that reason that Lewis is such a fun conversation partner in this, because he very much comes out of the modernist world that Sam Harris continues to express even in this context where postmodernity works quite strongly. So often rational is used as that which relates to non-religious reality. And so when you listen to the career atheists, listen for that use of the word. You'll hear Sam Harris use it in that way a lot, as will Matt Dillahunty, and I haven't listened to a lot of other career atheists or celebrity atheists. It's synonymous basically with their idea of truth. And so often when they use the word rational, you could just swap that word out and put the word truth in. Burning Widows is rational if it pursues a particular end. Now, this is a second definition, and this is, in a sense, what the definition that Adam was using. If it pursues a particular end, if it gives its tribe a survival advantage over its rivals, okay? Such a useful adaptation for a culture to achieve some competitive value over a rival culture. Now, they didn't actually use the word evolution in the little clip I played, but if you listen to the whole video, it's a pretty long video. I should say it's a long video. I mean, I give you longer videos for me, but it's the word evolution will come up. And in this context, evolution has also some definitions. It often implies that this particular adaptation affords a competitive advantage within an environment and against a particular rival. That's what we understand by Darwinian evolution, that certain adaptations allow certain groups or certain organisms or certain species or subspecies, or even getting back to Brett Weinstein's conversation on the Rebel Wisdom channel, that even a particular string of DNA wants the death of rival strings of DNA, even in Brett Weinstein's. Now pay attention to the use of the comparatives here. Even if a rival string of DNA functions better in terms of respiration than the other. Now morality. What is morality? Morality is a communal ought. This is how beings should act, how communities should act. It's a communal ought. Morality, if acted out consistently, affords that community advantage over rivals, such as communities that practice female equality outcompete against others that don't. And Jordan Peterson makes this comment often, that those societies which, because of their moral assumptions about male and female roles, those societies effectively take women out of the workplace, the academy, many other realms, and those societies are impoverished for removing women from those roles. And so Jordan Peterson would argue that male-female equality, and Peterson would stipulate that in terms of equality as equality of access, not equality of outcome, which he defines as equity, helps certain civilizations, certain societies that practice this outcompete other societies that don't. Now, and a little bit later, they have a very interesting part of the conversation where they play this out with respect to Nazis, of course, because Nazis are just the greatest and the worst illustration that you can almost always bring into an argument.
The cost benefit thing is what nature is doing. The Nazi argument that you're making, and this
now again, pay attention to what nature means here, because you have nature, evolution. This is, and when we use nature here, we want to use it as in a sense, blind system of selection. Now, Jordan Peterson might call this God number one in some ways, and C.S. Lewis will see nature as our sister, but pay attention now to this argument. I'll back it up a little bit.
This is the cost benefit thing is what nature is doing. The Nazi argument that you're making, and this is Jordan Peterson all the way. When Jordan Peterson talks about Darwinian truth, he's talking about the Darwinian framework is constantly adjudicating the truth value of moral statements, because the people that make those truth claims survive or are annihilated from history based on the validity of those truth claims.
So this is where you get into Jordan Peterson's pragmatic or Darwinistic understanding of truth. Now this, for Peterson, and we've talked about this before, this really comes out of it's most clearly stated in Jordan Peterson's Transliminal 2015 videos, where because of how we are and how little we can know and how little we can represent and how poorly we can track with truth, and this gets into some of the Don Hoffman stuff too, how poor we are, that which survives, well, that's kind of the definitive proof of truth, because you can't, I often say ontology is its own justification. You can't argue that, well, this particular biological mechanism is functional because that animal lives and reproduces. You might look at the koala and say, boy, there's a lot of issues with that koala, but you know what? It's still here. And you might look at the Norwegian rat and say, well, there's issues with the Norwegian rat, but they're a spectacularly capable species, and you can't argue with that truth. And so this is where you get into Jordan Peterson's Darwinian truth.
Now, from where I sit, the Nazis lost the war, and their truth claims have been proven incorrect. So materialistically, we can very much say that where that moral framework leads is no more Nazis. So I don't have any problem saying that they're incorrect, that they're wrong, that they lost. Guess who lost the war, buddy?
But only because they lost. So if they had have won,
yes, and you want to play this game too, which is what if they won the war? Well, what if horses evolved wings and could fly around like Pegasuses? Like there is the real world that sooner or later we have to contend with. So I would make the argument that they couldn't possibly win the war because their moral framework was untrue, was incorrect. Nature adjudicated that. It did. I would argue that if another Nazi regime came to rise, it would play out exactly the same way, because the Darwinian framework is always out there adjudicating truth. And the way that it adjudicates truth is, think about it. If the Nazis did rise up again, what would happen? The world would beat them down. I'm pretty certain of it. Like, we've made war illegal. War is illegal now.
Yeah.
Now, this is a really fascinating clip. So now I realize I'm doing a clip of the clipster there, but it's a really fascinating argument in terms of the Nazis that, well, this is Darwinian truth that they lost the war. And I read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands a few years ago, and it's a fascinating book in showing some of the counterproductive, well, what we look at upon as counterproductive ways that the Nazis were committed to their ideology of improving the race by exterminating the Jews and the Slavs and other people that they thought, their eugenicist mission of improving the race. And others look at that and say, you were giving yourself a survival disadvantage by devoting so many resources to killing the Jews. If you had just let the Jewish thing go, maybe you could have won. But now we're getting into the question of definition with Adam. Could the Nazis be Nazis without their anti-Semitism? That's a really interesting question, because it asks the question, could they have risen to the top of Germany without leveraging the engine of in-group, out-group racism against the Jews? Was it, I just read through Peter Leithart's really fine summary of Rene Girard, which is just on his blog post on Patheos, that web platform that has way too many ads, and not great ads either. But this gets into the real question of what we're talking about with respect to Darwin, and what we're talking about with respect to definition and survival, because what you're really boiling your moral system down to is that which survives. So what aspect of Nazism lost the war? Was it their progressivist racism that basically said, well, we were bettering the race by getting rid of Jews and other substandard races? Because again, in past videos I've laid out each of these worldviews, each of these religions, even political ideologies, has their telos. They have their goal, and the imagined goal of the Nazi theology, if you will, was the betterment of the race by the destruction of the Jews and other groups. And it's important to continue to remember those other groups as well. That was their worldview. So their worldview was the purification, the racial purification of humanity, whereas Marxism had the worldview of social struggle and social purification of humanity and materialist equality. Okay. I was watching David Brooks, and David, he always, every Friday, does this conversation with Shields and Brooks on PBS NewsHour, and Brooks was saying, the Democrats always wanted to, this is ironic because the Republican Party, at least an aspect of the establishment Republican Party, has been known as plutocrats. They're the party of the wealthy, the party of money. But Brooks goes on to say, yeah, but you don't understand. People vote because of social issues. And it's these identity issues that they vote on much more than just running on the election. And whereas Democrats want to talk about, well, this is what the government can do for you. And David Brooks just looks at that and says, you're not understanding how human beings work and what motivates them to act as they act. And so in a sense here we have a similar dynamic of the question of, okay, what motivated, what were Nazis at their heart? Was their anti-Semitism just a byproduct of Nazi-ishness, or was it at its heart? And so therefore you have the question, well, what exactly lost the war for the Nazis? If they had in fact loved the Jewish population of Germany and Austria and that part of Europe was some of the flat out most brilliant, most capable. Read The Alchemy of Air, which is a fascinating book about the fixation of nitrogen, and a very sad story about a Jewish man who wanted to fit into the mainstream. I've got all this Jewish stuff in my head because I just finished Andrew Klavan's beautiful memoir. Loved that book. But so what exactly is the aspect that of the Nazis that illustrates the Darwinian truth that both Adam and Jordan Peterson are bringing up in this conversation? Now, here's the thing. You've got time and context with all of these, and this is where I think the monarchical vision, this monarchical clean room that materialism also tends to have implicit in their system, shows its weakness, because at any given moment you can stop and say, well, this is clearly the dominant group. And so if you look at Germany at the end of in 1941, beginning of 1942, you could look at Germany and say, well, they're going to take over the world. And now if you pull that into your morality conversation, you're probably going to say something to the effect of, well, Germany is more moral than France, whose butt they just kicked. And this is the this is the difficulty of this method of looking at morality, because it's time dependent. We cannot evaluate any of this history apart from history. We're always standing within the stream, recognizing it, relatively speaking, against the other aspects. So huge protobirds dominated the planet for a time. We call them dinosaurs. And you'd have to ask the question, was T-Rex the moral king of the world? Now you might say, well, that was an animal, it doesn't have morality. Okay, but now we're beginning to see the weakness of this approach to grounding morality upon evolution. Nazis and Marxists beat out their competitors locally. So on a world stage, you might look and say, well, Nazis lost, therefore they don't have grounded proper morality. See, but what I'm arguing is that you've actually changed the definition of the word morality, because we have deep within us this idea of ought. And if you're going to get rid of that idea of ought and the separateness that I think Glen is actually, again, because he's a Christian, Glen is actually pointing to, I don't think you're using the same, your words have the same definition. Morality as Adam is and morality as Glen is, and what they're really talking about. So let's change the frame and let's look at Germany only and say, well, in that context, was anti-Semitism defeated? No, anti-Semitism defeated the communists in Germany and defeated the old guard in Germany, and Nazis rose to the top of the German pile. Now, Adam takes a step back and says, but they lost the war, and they would lose the war every time. Well, let's imagine that another planet somewhere in the universe has humanoid-type species. Let's say Adam and Crick were correct, and that somehow aliens came down and planted human beings here, and spaceships roll up on us and they've got swastikas under their belly. This could be a fascinating science fiction. And well, maybe Nazis lost in this world, but Nazis won in another world, and Nazis continue to take over all over the universe. Then you would have to say that Nazis are moral. And this gets into Matt Dillahunty's argument that, well, if you argue, and I think if Dillahunty and Adam talked, this is where Dillahunty would go with Adam. He'd say, well, what you're essentially saying is that which wins is moral. But that's not how we use morality, especially not in a Christian frame. If you, for example, read the beginning of the book of Revelation, we're going to get into eschatology here, because often, think about This Is My Father's World, this old Christian hymn. Although the ought seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. So Christianity has this idea that morality is somehow outside the system, and that morality has gravity that certainly pulls the world. But again, C.S. Lewis's definition of how we are rebels holding out against God and his morality. And if you read, for example, Larry Crabb is a Christian psychologist who's written a number of books. He's an American evangelical Christian. When he reads Genesis, he says part of what happens there in Genesis 3 in the rebellion in the garden is that we say to God, we want to be the ones to define morality, not you. Okay. Now this is where God number one and God number two, and the question of God's ontology, God as person or three persons, God acting in the world, now takes hold, because, well, we're having a moral argument with God about morality. And in fact, I think we see this played out all the time, not only in career atheists that say God is not good, but in all of our rebellious hearts. When some bad thing comes into our life, we look at this and say, I don't know if you are good, God. How can I trust you? And you'll hear me bring this up in my sermons quite a bit. C.S. Lewis writes The Problem of Pain in the 1940s, 1950s, where he's very much taking a philosophical approach to the problem of pain. And it's a wonderful book. It's all nicely wrapped up and put together. But then if you read A Grief Observed, when he himself descends into the pain after watching this surprise in his life, the surprise called joy of all things. And, God is an amazing author. So many ironies. And when joy is taken from him by cancer, and Lewis, who's been this, one of the outstanding Christian witnesses, apologists, verbal apologists, philosophers, he nearly loses his faith because his wife dies of cancer. And that is such a vital and important thing to think about, because on one hand, we can have all of our philosophy over here, but on the other hand, it has to be lived. And being lived means being lived in this world of tsunamis and cancer and heart disease and death and bankruptcy and alcoholism and brokenness. And Adam, a little bit later in this video, we'll say part of the thing that Jordan Peterson brings to these conversations with these celebrity atheists is Peterson is a psychologist, so he sits in a room with people who suffer. Because you cannot keep that out of the equation. And again, that's part of the poverty of the monarchical vision clean room that has this world of objects. You have to sneak suffering in there too, because objects don't suffer, they just are. But we do suffer. And so then this question of morality. Well, how can we know what is true? And we desperately want morality to be out there, because we desperately want to say, although I suffer and die, and on a rational level, I can see that as part of this ecosystem and perhaps part of what the world needs. The world needs me to age and die so that others can... But it just doesn't necessarily work, because another part of me says, no, I was not born to age. Legs were made for the purpose of dancing. Eyes were made for the purpose of seeing. Ears were made for the purpose of hearing. And that, in fact, these purposes, these joyful purposes, will not be always lost. And that is the God number 1 / God number 2 full picture of Christian eschatology that materialism just can't finally deal with. Because all legs in this world will be crippled and fail. All eyes will lose their sight. All ears will lose their hearing. And so therefore, the purpose for which eyes and ears and legs and hearts and loves were made will finally be dashed and destroyed in the cold death of the universe. And this is why purpose is fundamental to this, and why morality can't just be wedded to survival. So huge protobirds dominated the planet for a time. Was T-Rex the moral king? Nazis and Marxists beat out their competitors locally. Were they the moral king? If we just expand the frame or change the time, does morality change? That's pretty much the definition of relativism. Each moral kingdom of this type rises and falls. Let's imagine a eugenic super race. Let's imagine a eugenic super race pulls off their evil ploy to wipe out the rest of us. Who's us? Pay attention to us. Homo sapiens, without genetic modification or without much. The eugenicists, they're smart, and they launch themselves into space, and they're up in the satellite, and they let loose a biological bomb, and it wipes out all of regular natural-born Homo sapiens, so that they can now come down to the planet because they are so smart. They've engineered the germ to, once it loses its host, it dies out. So they just sit in orbit for another 6 months until we're all gone. Then they come down to the planet and they repopulate. Darwinian morality says this is good. in Genesis 1 fashion. Now we say, well, it isn't good because it wasn't what we wanted. See, and I think this definition of morality then gets boiled down into that which is good for me, or that which is good for my tribe, or that which is good for my subset. Because when you take a step back and say, see, we intermingled a bit, but we replaced the Neanderthals. We subsumed the Neanderthals. Therefore, it is good. I think we're using a different definition of the word good. But isn't this what we say Darwinian evolution is just without mind? Now, I don't think this even works for Darwinian evolution, and the reason is the Metaphysical Club, which is one of Jordan Peterson's recommended books. Darwin's fundamental insight as a biologist was that among groups of sexually producing organisms, the variations are much more important than the similarities. Okay? Natural selection, his name for mechanism of evolutionary development that he co-discovered with Alfred Russel Wallace, is the process by which individual characteristics that are more favorable to reproductive success are chosen, in quotation marks, of course, because here again our language betrays us that we can't talk about these things without choice. We don't have the language for them without, in effect, personifying evolution. Is the process by which individual characteristics that are more favorable to reproductive success are chosen because they are passed on from one generation to the next over characteristics that are less favorable. But again, favorable to what end? Darwin regretted the word selection suggested that the word selection suggested intention. Again, this is a hallmark of what, and I don't know that Darwin invented this. I think society just got to the point that Darwin was there at the tipping point. We don't need God to govern this process anymore. It happens on its own. Okay, and this is where you get into N.T. Wright's assertion that this is Epicureanism continuing to recycle back. You have Epicurean reincarnation, as it were. Darwin regretted the word selection suggested intention. Natural selection is a blind process. So what do you mean by blind? I mean, it has no telos. It is not looking into the future and saying, we want to get to this. It's just stumbling along blind. So even in the use of the word blind here, you have a metaphor that's being poured out. Natural selection is a blind process because the conditions to which the organism must adapt in order to survive are never the same. It's haphazard. Let's use that word. In periods of drought, when seeds are hard to find, finches that happen to have long, narrow beaks, good for foraging, will be favored over finches with broad, powerful beaks. More of their offspring will survive and reproduce. This is the process of imagined morality. If we're going to pin morality to this, you would say that those finches are good. But now again, I'd say we have two definitions of the word. You have one definition of good being that which achieves its end. Well, its end towards what? Its end towards survival. Or that which achieves this other quest towards how we all intuitively, I think, understand the other definition and sense of good to be. In periods of abundance, when seeds are large and their shells are hard, the broad-beaked finches will hold an adaptive advantage. Finchness, this is the key thing right here. Finchness is a variable, not a constant. And I think that's at the heart of this problem with understanding morality as Darwinian competition. Because that which survivesness is the variable. And we smuggle around with this with the slippery use of the first person plural. Us, we. Who do you mean by we? Well, our eugenic or our AI or our cyber descendants that replace us, are they we? Is it my racial group? Is it my religious tribe? Is it my national group? Is that what we is? And now if you pay careful attention, always follow the we. Always follow the us. and ask yourself, when someone uses that word, specifically who is we? Specifically who is us? Because that's where all the slipperiness is happening. Finchness is the variable, not the constant. Darwin thought that variations do not arise because organisms need them, which essentially is what Lamarck had argued. He thought that variations occur by chance. Okay, now what's by chance? Well, chance is that which is so complex we as human beings can't track them. But materialists assert by faith that there's no such thing as chance, that it's billiard balls all the way down. And that chance determines their adaptive utility. In all seasons, it happens that some finches are born with marginally longer and narrower beaks than others, such as children of the same parents are not exactly the same height. In certain environmental conditions, a narrower beak will have positive or negative survival value, but in other conditions, for example, when seeds are plentiful and finches are few, it may make no difference. The selection of favorable characteristics is therefore neither designed nor progressive. There's no morality. No intelligence, divine or otherwise, determines in advance the relative value of individual variations, and there is no ideal type of finch or essence of finchness towards which adaptive changes are leading. But notice when we use this language in terms of us in evolution, we assume our usness. But even in the case of the Nazis, we're not even exactly sure what is the essence of Nazi. So then we get into eschatology, which is end things, which gets into purpose, goals. That which survivesness always wins. And by definition of Darwinian morality, that is what is more moral. But again, this is always dependent on time, when, and context. In other words, morality then gets, by definition, relative. Because the moment that you make your decision, well, you're stuck in that moment. And I think that's part of the way that this naturalistic approach to the world falls apart. It really, and I think this is based on a lot of the other videos that I've made, you've got naturalism as the problem of time. Because, well, according to naturalism itself, time is running out. And in the end, in the cold material energy death of the universe, nothingness is good. Because nothingness wins. Nothingness survives. And I think part of us knows this in our head, that we suddenly we're opening our door to, David Benatar and his, ought better to not have been born. I don't think it's moral. Whatever succeeds us, Homo sapiens, will be our moral superiors. This is not generally how we imagine the word to be used. Now, this is from Andrew Klavan's book, which I just finished today. Now, bear in mind, if I liked a book and I just finished it, I always fall in love with the last book I read that I really liked, but I really enjoyed this book. This is part of Andrew Klavan's process. He wanted to go to full-blown atheism, but he drew back. Why? Because he was reading the Marquis de Sade. And as he read the Marquis de Sade, he saw, in a sense, full-blown atheism, and he said, I can't tolerate this definition of morality. Why should I do what's good for society? What is society to me? None of this elaborate game theory nonsense where we all benefit from mutual sacrifice and restraint that only works until no one's looking. Then I'll get away with what I can. If there is no God, there is no good, and sadistic pornography is scripture. But the opposite is also true. That is, if we concede that one thing is morally better than another, it can only be because it comes closer to an ultimate moral good. the standard by which it's measured. An ultimate moral good cannot be just an idea. It must be, in effect, a personality with consciousness and free will. The rain isn't morally good, even though it makes the crops grow. A tornado that kills isn't morally evil, though it may be an evil for those in its way. Happy and sad events from birth to death just happen, and we ascribe moral qualities to them as they suit us or don't. But true, objective good and evil, in order to be good and evil, have to be aware and intentional. So an ultimate moral good must be conscious and free. It must be God. So we have to choose. Either there is no God and no morality whatsoever, or there is morality and God is real. Either way makes sense if you're speaking strictly about logic. I didn't reject Saad's outlook on logical grounds. I rejected it because I found it repulsive and I knew it wasn't true, just as I know that 1 + 1 always equals 2, always equals 2 + 1. That 1 + 2 always equals 2 + 1, though neither I nor anyone else can prove it. So too, I know that a Nazi who tortures a child to death is less moral than a priest who gives a beggar bread. And that is so even in a world that is all Nazis everywhere. In the chain of reasoning that took me finally to Christ, accepting this one axiom that some actions are morally better than others, and I would insert here, not just because they enhance survivability within a certain frame, is the only truly non-logical leap of faith I ever made. Hardly a leap, really, barely even a step. I know it's so, and those who declare they do not are, like Hamlet, only pretending. After reading Saad, I abandoned atheism and returned to agnosticism. I couldn't quite bring myself to follow my own logic to its conclusions. That is, I couldn't quite bring myself to accept the existence of God, but I knew the road to hell when I saw it, and I chose to go home by another way. And again, I can really recommend Andrew Klavan's book. Now, I saw Andrew Klavan talk to Ben Shapiro. I don't watch Daily Wire. At some point, Mr. Reagan's going to edit up the conversation that he and I had. I'm not really a political conservative, and so I don't find the partisan bickering. I find partisan bickering distasteful, even though I sometimes get caught in it. But I really enjoyed Andrew Klavan in both his conversation with Ben Shapiro and in this lovely book. It's a lovely, lovely, lovely book. Really enjoyed it. And maybe it's because he grew up on Long Island 9 years before I grew up in New Jersey, and so there was enough cultural reference between us. I didn't grow up in a self-consciously Jewish home. My family had subverted its Jewishness before, long before I ever grew up, and we even knew about our ancestry as Jews in the Netherlands. But that's part of my ancestry. I've got the Dutch and there too. But yeah, it's a lovely, lovely book. So the good and that which survives finally come together. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got Matt Dillahunty's "What If God is Satan?" Well, what is good? That which was overflowing joy and goodness made the world. That same joy and goodness will finally overcome all process of lesser joy and goodness. So, in the end, eschatology, what remains? Well, it's joy. It's the joy in the eternal Creator. Again, I'm a Christian, Trinitarian God, that overflowed into the creation of the world. We rebelled against it. Nature rebelled against us. And we're working through that process right now. But in the end, we will go back to joy and goodness. Not the heat death of the universe, but whatever it is, the great author of creation has planned for next chapters. Well, how do I know it will be good? Well, that's trust. How can I trust this author of the universe that in the words of one of my friend, my God kills puppies and grandmas. Yeah. And this gets into a lot of Christian theology about God's will, God's intention, God's allowing, so on and so forth. Can't go there right now because I want to wrap up this video. But I can trust him because, again, he sends his son. And because he writes himself into the story and becomes our victim so he could become our savior. So, and that, I think, is good. And I think it does finally triumph. And I think that's essentially what the book of Revelation is about. So, Adam, great video. Glenn, great conversation. Look forward to talking to you. And I hope the rest of you have enjoyed this.